Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating, Pede Hollist's award-winning novel, So the Path Does Not Die. Now, you probably already know this isn't just your standard story about moving from point A to point B. It is a profound, messy, and incredibly real exploration of displacement. What does it actually mean to find your way home in a world that's globalizing at breakneck speed? Well, we're going to unpack some brilliant academic frameworks today to really get to the bottom of this narrative.
And honestly, the entire conflict of this story can be anchored by this one singular piece of advice from the protagonist's grandmother: never cut the rope. It perfectly captures the massive tension Fina faces. Think about it. It's that intense push and pull between wanting your own personal freedom but desperately needing that cultural connection. How exactly do you honor your roots when those very same roots are the things causing you pain?
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll briefly set the stage with the core plot, and then we're going to track Fina's journey using a fascinating academic framework called the Migration Quadrangle, taking us through her departure, her sense of unhomeliness, her return, and the cultural conflicts she navigates along the way. All right, let's jump right into part one, the core plot. Hollist uses his central protagonist, Fina, and her supporting cast brilliantly embody these clashing forces of tradition and survival. Fina is our rock. She's resilient, she's ambitious, but she's deeply culturally conscious. Then you have her mother and grandmother, who symbolize that ancestral path that must not die. On the flip side, the men in her life really represent these failed expectations and gender imbalances. And then her immigrant friends, like Kizzy, they mirror the wildly diverse and often really painful ways that people try to cope with the trauma of leaving home. Fina's physical movements literally span the globe. But as we'll see, her psychological journey is just as vast. She starts off in the rural village of Talaba, relocates to the capital city of Freetown, crosses the Atlantic to the United States, and then eventually makes this stunning return to a post-war Sierra Leone.
Which brings us to the first phase of our analytical framework: the departure.
To truly understand what Fina goes through, we have to talk about quadrangle migration. You're probably familiar with the historical triangular slave trade, right? That was forced and offered zero chance of return. But modern migration in this novel is a quadrangle. It's this irregular, evolving cycle of departure, travel, assimilation, and, this is the crucial part, an eventual return to the homeland, bringing all that newly acquired knowledge back to where it all started. And African literary texts like this one are literally the perfect sandbox for examining these complex identity processes. As scholar Juliana Daniels points out, literature gives us a concrete, tangible way to see the networks of influence and all those intense debates over authenticity that totally shape the post-colonial and diasporic experience. So why does Fina leave in the first place? Well, she is pushed out by dual traumas. First, back in Talaba, her father disrupts a forced female circumcision ceremony to save her. It's an act that brings massive shame to the family and literally forces them to flee to Freetown. But then in Freetown, Fina is marginalized all over again. She's labeled a Fulamusu, facing severe ethnic discrimination because the ethnic Fulas are treated as inferiors there. She ultimately flees to America with this desperate hope of escaping that ethnic bias and cultural inflexibility entirely. Now, let's look at stages 2 and 3, her transatlantic journey and her arrival in the United States, where, you guessed it, things do not go as planned. Talk about a harsh contrast between expectation and reality. Fina thought America would be this safe haven, totally free from the tribalism of Sierra Leone. The reality? She steps off the plane right into a landscape of intense racism and classism. She realizes she hasn't escaped the target on her back, she just swapped it out for a completely new one that labels her as Black, African, and foreign. Or worse, an alien. Academics use Homi Bhabha's concept of unhomeliness to explain this exact psychological state, and it captures Fina's experience perfectly. Unhomeliness isn't just feeling homesick. It is the deeply traumatic, estranging tension of living your daily life in one place while your brain is entirely entangled with another. Geographically, Fina is trying to figure out cold, confusing American bus schedules, but psychologically, she is constantly haunted by the sights and smells of Sierra Leone and her grandmother's voice echoing in her head, telling her not to cut the rope. This intense state of unhomeliness actually triggers what Stella Ting-Tomi calls identity negotiation theory. It's essentially a 3-step survival guide for building a composite identity, obtaining sociocultural group membership, developing relational roles, and finally, achieving individual self-reflexiveness.
Fina has to somehow navigate all three of these steps under immense pressure, constantly trying to balance her own ambitions with the really restrictive societal roles being forced onto her.
Because, let's be real, you don't really think about your identity until it's in crisis, right? When things are stable, we just exist. But Fiona is in a constant state of crisis. She isn't just an immigrant, she's an African woman simultaneously navigating these massive, intersecting roadblocks of gender, geography, and ethnicity.
She quickly runs into a very harsh, three-tiered racial ladder in the US. You have whites at the top, non-black races in the middle, and people of African descent on the lowest rungs. But even within that bottom tier, there is incredible fragmentation. We see this firsthand when Fina's boss, Juanita, who is also a woman of color, wrongly accuses Fina at a childcare center simply because she is African. It's a painful proof point that class, race, and geographic origin all crash into each other for Africans in the diaspora.
Eventually, after finding financial success but feeling a deep psychological void, Fina enters the final stage of the quadrangle, the return. And this is the big question, right? It defies literally all expectations of the typical immigrant narrative. Her friends in the novel are absolutely stunned. Why on earth would anyone leave the safety, the upscale neighborhood, and the so-called success of America to go back to a war-torn country and the insanity of Sierra Leone?
Well, the answer is pretty profound. Feda has the green card, the nice car, the townhouse, and she realizes it leaves her completely empty. There's actually a strange kind of stability in knowing exactly what brand of insanity to expect back home. She figures out that true wholeness is only going to come from returning to her roots, helping heal her displaced people, and physically connecting her past back to her present. That brings us to our final piece today, the deeper cultural conflicts Fina faces when she finally does go back. Because returning home, it's never simple. Academics call this the has-been syndrome. It takes the abstract idea of identity and grounds it in very real, very messy interpersonal conflict. It's the friction between the people who stayed behind and the returnees who left and came back. The returnees are often viewed with deep suspicion, or they're hit with completely unrealistic financial expectations by family members who stayed. Fina feels this disconnect intensely.
Here, we get to see two completely different survival mechanisms for dealing with the trauma of migration. Look at Fina compared to her peer Kizzy. Kizzy is so diminished by the negative connotations of being Black in America that he desperately wants to just erase his African identity entirely. But Fina, she rolls up her sleeves and does the hard work. She actively negotiates her dual identity, accepting her cultural scars, both physical and emotional, to finally find some peace.
And that is the true crux of identity negotiation theory in action. By actually embracing her ethnic identity instead of running away from it, Fina is able to bridge that massive gap between where she came from and who she has become. She negotiates her way back to cultural harmony, and in doing so, she successfully closes the loop of the migration quadrangle.
Fina's grandmother once told her, "A wise woman walks through the high grass where the elephant has already trod." But, crucially, she added, "Do not follow footprints in the sand." Fina takes this completely to heart when she returns. She doesn't just blindly follow the damaging traditions of her past. She finds her village in ruins, and she chooses a totally new path. She adopts displaced war victims, like the blind Mama Yegbe and the former child soldier's wife, Moaf. She keeps her ancestral path alive through compassion and community building, rather than rigid, harmful tradition.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder as you reflect on Fina's incredible journey of displacement and homecoming. How do we honor where we come from while still forging our own healthy individual identities? Pede Hollist's masterpiece suggests that the path doesn't die, as long as we are brave enough to walk it our own way. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring those paths.